Following on from the largely successful Season 7, Jon Pertwee's second season would continue with the cost-saving and audience-relating Earth-based setting. The unit family that had been started the previous season would be expanded on with the addition of Jo Grant and Captain Mike Yates alongside the Doctor, Brigadier and Sergeant Bent. Jo Grant, played by Katy Manning, was the replacement for Caroline John's Liz Shaw, who unceremoniously left off-screen between seasons without explanation. Producer Barry Letts decided to discard the character because he believed the companion needs to be an audience surrogate, to ask the Doctor questions and explain things to the viewers at home. As a scientist, if the Doctor asked Liz to pass something, she just would, whereas they needed someone who would ask what it was. Cue Jo Grant, an 18-year-old who failed her science O-levels.
I'm your new assistant.
Oh no.
She only got the job because of her uncle's connections. Over the course of the following seasons, Jo would grow and develop into being a strong and independent character, whilst the audience learnt to grow with her, all whilst being played by the enigmatic Katy Manning, who brought a youthful, modern aspect to the show. I mean, just look at her fashion. Whilst being inquisitive and just so lovable, Jo Grant encapsulated the 70s with her mini-skirts, free-spirited go-go style and hippie attitudes. She placed Doctor Who firmly in the modern times. Also, Katy used to date Jimi Hendrix. Not related, that's just a fact that messes with everyone's heads. Captain Yates, however, played by Richard Franklin, didn't have the same character development. He was very much just the tertiary unit character and was only really used when he was needed, and plus to make sort of a love interest for Jo that never really pans out. It was only in the last season where Mike had any sort of an arc, betraying unit, but that's best discussed in Season 11. With the Brigadier being seen as the Watson to the Doctor's Sherlock Holmes, it was thought that what they needed was to introduce a Moriarty. So all 5 serials of this season would feature a new character, the Master.
I am usually referred to as the Master.
Oh, is that so?
Universally.
Played by Roger Delgado, the Master was a much more sterner character than the Doctor, but yet still kept with the inherent campy nature. Old childhood friends, where the Doctor seeks to help others, the Master seeks to rule the universe, often making deals with alien invaders or pulling strings behind the scenes. The Master will go on to be a villain as synonymous with Doctor Who as the Daleks and Cybermen. Like the Doctor, the Master has had many incarnations over the years. Roger Delgado, Peter Pratt, Jeffrey Beavers, Anthony Ailey, Eric Roberts, Derek Jacobi, John Sim, Michelle Gomez and most recently Sacha Dhawan, facing 9 of the 11 Doctors since Pertwee. Whilst there has been headcanons, abandoned storylines and expanded media explanations that the Doctor and Master are brothers or of their origin,
Thought you were going to say he was your secret brother or something.
You've been watching too much TV.
one thing does remain constant: they are rivals. Well, except when they aren't. For the first Master, they cast Spanish-Belgian actor Roger Delgado, who has a much more sinister-looking face than Jon Pertwee, with the goatee beard and the dark turtleneck, polar opposites of each other, but yet they both have the same sort of campy nature to them, in Delgado's case it being more of a fed-up, why aren't things going my way sort of look. The two were perfect opposites to each other and would appear together many times in 8 serials. And so the Master would make his first appearance in the season opener, which would also see the return of the previous opener's villains, Robert Holmes's Terror of the Autons. We are thrown straight into the Master. From episode 1 we follow his scheming plans and conflict with the Doctor like he had always been there, interfering with a plastics manufacturer using their products to stage these assassinations, in which the censors and more sensitive viewers found plenty to complain about. This story made more use of everyday plastic products and making them scary, whereas Spearhead had mainly just used the shop window dummies motif. Everything from a telephone wire to plastic flowers are now a threat. The Doctor steals some circuitry from the Master's TARDIS, rendering it useless, in the hope of fixing his own and finally escaping Earth, only for it to literally blow smoke in his face. This then evolves into a runaround with the Master always one step ahead of the Doctor and Jo. This is best shown in the bit where the Master, using his hypnotic powers, stages an assault on the pair at a circus, and the police turn up to escort them away, only for the policemen to be revealed to be Autons themselves. This cliffhanger also raised complaints that they were teaching children to fear the police, an odd take given Holmes was himself once a policeman. This leads to quite a memorable action sequence of Car versus Autons, with pyrotechnics to boot and the stuntman actually falling down a cliff and managing to just pick himself up like nothing happened. The story eventually leads us back to the radio telescope where the story began, where the Master tissue compressed a man to death and left him in his lunchbox, and then left a bomb that almost kills a Doctor were it not for the intervention of this Time Lord. The depiction of Time Lords here is significant because this was the first time seeing a non-renegade Time Lord outside of the War Games. Previously they had been shown to be all-powerful, omnipotent, ruling beings with technology and intelligence beyond our comprehension. Here the Time Lord is another eccentric, wearing an upper-class suit and bowler hat to try and fit in whilst he's levitating hundreds of feet in the air. This more mundane, imperfect depiction of the Time Lords would later be expanded throughout the 70s, spearheaded by the likes of Holmes himself. The climax of this story sees the Nestene consciousness manifest with the help of the radio dishes. Here is depicted as being this big ball of glowing light, whereas other depictions had seen it as a big squid-like monster, even described as such earlier. In the CGI upgraded version released on the collection set in 2021, we see a more squid-like version. In fact, this upgrade would do a lot of good for this story. As Doctor Who is now being produced in colour, this allowed for the use of green screens, or CSO, to be able to create effects not before possible.
Now, it's not very likely that we should want to build a set like this in the studio for Doctor Who. If we had a scene like this, we'd obviously go out and film it. But it'd be a little more difficult to go out and film an alien space centre the size of TC1. So we're trying an experiment with models in a colour separation overlay setup. These are models, like this, for example. You see? Here is the model. And that was overlaid with CSO into the situation with Margot over there on the other camera. She is merely standing against blue flats set up against a blue cyc, saturated blue, of course, the colour separation overlay colour.
This had been first experimented with in Season 7, at first with Doctor Who and the Silurians. But in Terror of the Autons, director and also producer, which would mean he's uncredited, Barry Letts, relied too heavily on this technology. There is one infamous shot where a green screen is used to put a woman in a non-existent kitchen. The blue outlines and the horrible perspective line shows that they just weren't quite ready to be using CSO on such a scale, especially when it wasn't necessary. They were thinking along the lines of what was only being used in big budget Hollywood blockbusters. Fortunately, the 2021 upgrade cleaned up a lot of these effects. In the end, after a big unit action piece, the transmitters are turned off, the Autons rendered inert, and the Master is shot and captured. Or is he? The Master of Disguise, he has masked an innocent, hypnotised man as himself and manages to escape, only to return once again in the following story, the Mind of Evil.
Let the sentence of the court be carried out.
I knew there was something evil.
Don Houghton's second and final Doctor Who story after the impeccable Inferno the previous season. The first thing to note about this serial is that the first episode is in black and white. This is because, unlike many of the other Pertwee episodes that were only found in black and white, this copy couldn't have colour recovery or chroma dot applied to it. However, for the DVD release in 2013, it was colorised by hand, practically frame by frame, by Stuart Humphreys, aka Babel Colour. This was a long and tiresome process, but means that the only black and white Pertwee left is Invasion of the Dinosaurs Part 1. The story begins with the Doctor and Jo turning up to a prison to witness a new technique in rehabilitation to mentally alter the violent criminals, neutering them into benign, fearful, innocent people. Of course, all goes wrong when the machine, the Keller machine, turns out to be an alien being and starts killing people by showing them what they most fear, scaring them to death. At the same time, UNIT is dealing with an international summit, but lo and behold, the Master is plotting something. By hypnotising the Chinese diplomat, played by Don Houghton's wife Pik Sen Lim, he stages an attempted assassination of the American ambassador, using the Keller device. It could be argued that it's a bit racist that the Chinese character turns into a Chinese dragon, but what's happening here is that the American is seeing what he most fears, that being the symbolic Chinese dragon. This shows the fearful relationship between the West and China, something that still persists to this day, and an almost identical allegory would later be used in Frontier in Space. Back at the prison, and it turns out the Master is involved there too, using the Keller machine to start prison riots. It must be said that the multi-level prison set is pretty impressive, with rooms coming off the sides that make the scenes and action flow much easier. The Master is planning to use the paranoia and angst of the hyped up prisoners to steal a nuclear missile. That's a real missile, by the way, not a prop, and launch it right in the middle of the now heightened World Conference. But once the Keller machine starts going out of control, he and the Doctor have to work together to shut it down, and it takes the nuclear warhead to do that. It's hard to believe, but The Mind of Evil was broadcast only a couple of weeks after the premiere of A Clockwork Orange, and it was of course written and filmed long before then. Like Kubrick's film, The Mind of Evil was clearly inspired by the same roots as Anthony Burgess's 1962 novel. The violent prisoners who are mentally neutered by a horrifying psychological technique. Of course, A Clockwork Orange was only one of a number of British films at the time that are exploring identity and our psychology. Others such as Performance and Don't Look Now were popular at the time. Also were the ultra-violent films, the likes of Get Carter, Straw Dogs and Frenzy. The Mind of Evil also has these elements, with the unit retaking of the prison sequence being so epic that it was replayed in its entirety in the following episode. The Havoc stunts seem really on top form here. But this would come at a cost. The reshoots of the action sequences, the helicopter, the prison set, etc. drove up the costs to well over budget. Despite how well this all turned out, this would be Timothy Coombs' last bout at directing Doctor Who. Mind of Evil has its memorable moments. The Keller terror sequences are distinct, the Master seeing the Doctor laughing and mocking him, and the Doctor seeing all of his past adversaries, though why Killian made it in is anyone's guess. Fans and kids at the time must have loved trying to identify all the monsters and creatures we see flying past the screen, and this is the first time we hear a Dalek voice in 4 years since Evil of the Daleks. This is a serial that should be talked about a lot more often, but I feel that because of its black and white episode, they always got pushed to the back of release schedules both on VHS and DVD, that it didn't get noticed as much as it should, and is easily one of the most underrated Doctor Who stories ever. In spite of its great action, sets, effects, political commentary, and being the Doctor Who story that best captures the early 70s cinema, having a trifecta of psychological thriller, political conspiracy thriller, and, the Doctor being a cross between James Bond and Quatermass. But also in the cinemas of 1971, the special effects advisor of 2001 A Space Odyssey, Douglas Turnbull, was making waves, making both the Andromeda Strain and directing Silent Running in this year, as well as George Lucas making his debut with THX 1138. Science fiction was starting to be seen as a more serious and awe-inspiring genre on the big screen. It would still be a few years before the genre would explode, threatening Doctor Who, but for now people were starting to understand that it was a serious vessel for self-exploration and political commentary. Speaking of which...
If I could leave, I would. If only to get away from people like you.
Doctor?
And your petty obsessions. England for the English, good heavens, man. I have a duty to my country, not to the world.
The Claws of Axos is yet another heavily politically motivated Pertwee-era story. In it, an alien vessel, Axos, crashes to Earth, causing a snowstorm. This line was only added in order to explain the sudden blizzard during filming, and to deliver it they brought back Fernando Marlowe as Corporal Bell from the previous serial. Albeit walk-on parts, this makes her one of the few recurring unit characters. Within the vessel are literally golden beings, a man, woman, boy and girl, all made of pure gold. This is the perfect image of idealistic aliens, and they come bearing axonite, a material that can increase the mass of anything, potentially ending world hunger. Of course, the far-right nationalist politician who's on the scene sees this as a great opportunity, not for the world, but for Britain, and desperately tries to make a deal with these beautiful aliens as quickly as possible. But not all is as it seems. These seemingly beautiful aliens are in reality these orange tentacle blob things, and they're only a part of a single living being that is the vessel, Axos. And this promise of unlimited resource is nothing more than a ploy to spread Axonite so it can consume all of the energy of the entire world. Also, the Master's in there. Turns out he was captured and led Axos to Earth. With the Doctor and Joe's help, he escapes, seemingly wanting to help stop Axos, but in reality looking for his own escape. This of course leads to a unit action sequence at a nearby particle accelerator, where they seem to turn some of the Axons into soap, or I don't really know what's supposed to be going on here. As Axos now wants the TARDIS in order to travel through time, the Doctor manages to trick them into stealing the Master's TARDIS, with the Master in, and sticks them in a perpetual time loop from which they'll seemingly never escape. In my opinion, the Claws of Axos is a very standard Pertwee era episode, not that that's a bad thing. The style, the setting, the music, the political themes, the action, the Master. If I were to summarise the Pertwee era with a single serial, it would be this one. Whilst a lot of it seems rinse and repeat, there are some interesting elements thrown in. That American guy, for example, and Pigbin Josh. I mean, who couldn't love Pigbin Josh? But what stands out is Axos itself. Being manipulative like it is, and the monster of the week actually being the set that the characters are walking around in, is certainly original, with a very well realised set that does feel like it could be the insides of an organic being. Michael Ferguson's direction shows most with the action sequences, but also with these trippy psychological sequences, such as when the Doctor and Joe try to escape the bowels of Axos. This story would mark the first contribution of writing pair Bob Baker and Dave Martin to Doctor Who would go on to co-write many serials through the 70s. It also marked the first time the TARDIS interior was seen in the 70s, which brings us on to the next serial, the first one in which we see the TARDIS in action in the 70s, the first story set on a different planet in a different time, in colour. Colony in space. Yeah, they forgot the TARDIS is meant to dissolve. What's interesting about this story is that it opens with what appears to be a Time Lord office meeting. They discuss a doomsday weapon and decide to assign the Doctor to go deal with it. This is why they allow the TARDIS to work and take us to Xarius in the year 2472. Written by the ever-political Malcolm Hulke, the Doctor and Joe find themselves in the middle of a territorial dispute between a group of colonists, one of which is played by Corrie star Helen Worth, and a fascistic mining corporation. The Doctor soon discovers that the mysterious beast that is killing the colonists is actually the miners murdering them in an attempt to drive them away. But in the middle of this, there is the natives, the primitives as they're known. Over the course of the 6 episodes, we discover that there is a more intelligent subspecies of the Xarians that many years ago developed a doomsday weapon that destroyed their society. Surprise surprise, the Master turns up, impersonating an Earth adjudicator, when in reality he wants his hands on this weapon. It's worth noting the image of the real adjudicator, that's an image of Assistant Floor Manager Graham Harper. This image will be important in a few seasons, I'm not kidding. Of course, a violent conflict erupts between the colonists and miners. In the end, the Doctor self-destructs the doomsday weapon and the colonists defeat the miners. To deliver the first alien planet in the show in over 2 years, they of course went to a quarry. Unfortunately for the first colour alien planet we ever see, this China clay quarry is very, very grey, and it was made even worse by the bad February weather. The clay turned into a sea of mud. The actors had to wade through this grey sludge in freezing cold conditions, and their only toilet being a portaloo that blew away whilst Manning was using it. Despite these conditions, the young ambitious director Michael Bryant made the best that he could, and would go on to direct many more serials throughout the 70s. However, it must be said that this is a very dull story. For all that's going on, it isn't visually interesting, having this very grey colour palette, and drags across its 6 parts, likely preferring a 4-part layout. However, a 2009 Radio Times review described it as rolling out eventfully over a 6-week period, but that it is indigestible in a single sitting, as it would often be viewed nowadays. Interestingly, this would be the first Season 8 serial to be novelised only 3 years later in 1974, under the title Doctor Who and the Doomsday Weapon, which, as the title suggests, had more emphasis on the weapon than the territorial dispute. This was also written as Joe Grant's introduction, meaning that the Terror of the Autons novelisation would need to be amended to accommodate this.
Watch out for the wings there. 5 rounds rapid.
Credited as being written by Guy Leppard, this serial was really written by Barry Letts and Robert Sloman under the pseudonym due to Letts also being the producer. This meant that the script was much more tailored to the actors themselves, being partly based on Manning's audition script, allowing the best of the actors to come out in this story that they all loved making. So much so that in 1993 they returned to Oldbourne, where it was filmed, to make the making-of video Return to Devil's End, released by Real Time Pictures. It also spawned 2 real-time spin-offs, Daemons Rising in 2004 and The White Witch of Devil's End in 2017, the latter essentially being Damaris Heyman reprising her role of Miss Hawthorne, telling a series of short stories over 3 bloody hours. The story saw an archaeological dig being broadcast live on BBC Three, which, bear in mind, wouldn't exist for another 20 years, which the Doctor insists must be stopped. However, it's too late and they uncover a shrunken spaceship that was buried in the mound. Turns out the Master is leading a satanic cult in the crypt, cavern, don't want to annoy the Christians, much to the annoyance of the local witch, Miss Hawthorne, who's having to put to rest all the unnatural goings-on. Then this gargoyle called Bok comes to life. Yes, this is a silly one. Units arrive on the scene but are trapped outside the heat barrier, with the Doctor, Joe, Mike and Benton inside, with a bunch of hypnotised villagers who tie up the Doctor in this maypole. The Master's plan is to summon Azal, the origin of the horned beast myths. I swear I've heard that somewhere before. Played by Stephen Thornton, who was cast both due to his tall stature and his deep, booming voice from his work as a radio actor.
This is the one we spoke of! He too is not of this planet!
You can just tell Delgado's loving this. The conclusion of the story is a bit of a disappointment. Jo offers to sacrifice herself in the Doctor's place, and Azal cannot comprehend this act of selflessness and just goes. Whilst this ending's a bit of a non sequitur, I've always thought it as being more supposed to be a demonstration of Jo's character development and the strength of her and the Doctor's relationship that has developed over the past season. This is a well-known and beloved fan-favourite story, often coming near the top of polls and fan favourite lists, and it's no secret that it was one of the favourites of many of the people involved. Even though the director Christopher Barry and Jon Pertwee didn't get on particularly well, they've both said that this is their favourite stories, Barry having only agreed to do it because of a damn good script. This serial's gothic style is comparable to the Hammer horror films, which is something that Who would later lean a lot further into going into the Hinchcliffe era. That said, some more recent retrospective reviews have been a bit more critical, criticising the plot as being a bit of a mess, that resolution notwithstanding, but at the end of the day it is beloved both by fans and the people who made it, and always will have its place. One thing I find interesting is that the colour restoration that had to be applied to some episodes, despite Barry Letts specifically requesting that this one be preserved, leaves a slightly orange warm wash due to the colour restoration not working as well with blues. I've always liked this warm effect due to the heat barrier and satanic theme, making the film itself feel warm. It's also worth noting that this serial is only 5 episodes long, making it alongside The Dominators and The Mind Robber from Season 6 one of only 3 5-part serials. The season was commissioned for 26 episodes, but ended up being 25 episodes like the previous Season 7 due to production difficulties. At the end of the story, the Master is finally captured by UNIT, meaning we won't see him again until Season 9's The Sea Devils, where he's still in prison. The Daemons would be repeated in December of that year in a shortened single-part omnibus format. This was the first Doctor Who serial to do so, and would be a regular part of the festive season schedule, often being viewed more than the original serial until 1977. This Christmas broadcast achieved 10.5 million viewers, whereas the original mostly sat around the low 8 millions. Season 8 premiered on New Year's Day 1971, and for the most part continued the new Earth-based format introduced to re-energise the show. This would start to be faded away as the following seasons would see the Doctor and Jo travelling to alien planets and other times more and more. But this season still managed to evolve from the already perfect Season 7. The introduction of a new iconic companion in the form of Katy Manning's Jo Grant, and a new iconic villain in the form of Roger Delgado's The Master, Alongside the unit team, this was starting to become more of an ensemble show than it ever had been before. Whilst it's the weak link of the season, Colony in Space showed how a Doctor-Jo dynamic could work. The first time a Doctor had travelled with only a single companion since Stephen in the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Eve. Whilst this season kept very much to what had worked, it still revolutionised the show in a way that is still felt today. Whilst many of these stories may not enjoy the fanfare of others, with time some of these serials are becoming more appreciated, and it really must be congratulated on the risks that Letts was still willing to make to try and achieve the best quality show possible that pushed the boundaries of what tea time television could be, even if it didn't always work. I'm looking at you now, CSO. But at the end of it, you have a group of ambitious people who all enjoyed working together to make what was in the end some damn good TV.